the organization of the human nervous system, a little bit, and just a little bit about embryology and development because I think it's helpful. These are terms you'll hear, um, diencephalon, for instance, and learning a little bit more about embryology, just a touch, will help you in your understanding later of neurology and of the clinical medicine associated. We talked in an earlier lecture about different ways in which we describe the organization of the nervous system. When we're talking about the nervous system, we often divide it into the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is everything else. And particularly when we're talking about the peripheral nervous system, we generally consider that it has two arms, a sensory division or afferent division, signals in, um, that come from sensory receptors that can be in the skin, in muscles, in tendons and joints, in organs of special senses like the tongue and the ear and the balance organs, the semicircular canals, and the eyes. And then there's the motor division, which is efferent or signals out, where the signal is generated within the central nervous system. Sensory signals are received in the central nervous system. Motor signals are generated in the central nervous system and terminate at muscles, skeletal muscles in the case of the voluntary skeletal muscle system, smooth muscle in the autonomic nervous system, and glands and cardiac muscle as well. So there is in the peripheral nervous system a sensory arm, which is afferent, signals in, and a motor arm, which is efferent, signals out. Just some definitions which will help you to understand descriptions in neurology and sometimes imaging, because these are planes that have become extremely important in imaging, particularly the central nervous system. We knew about these planes or defined these planes in the past when we were talking about gross anatomy, basically how you took a knife and cut the brain into sections. These days, we have virtual sections in our imaging using uh, radiology, using x-rays, and using magnetic resonance. So the three planes I want you to think about are the coronal plane, which is coronal is crown. So imagine a coronal plane being like a tiara sitting on top of the head. It is from the the slice is in this plane, and coronal sections proceed from the front of the brain to the back of the brain. So this green slice is a coronal plane, a coronal section. There is the horizontal or axial plane, which is a slice that is parallel to the floor. The coronal plane is parallel to a wall, as is the sagittal plane. The coronal plane you could consider parallel if you're looking at a person, parallel to the wall behind them. The axial plane is parallel to the floor. It proceeds from the top to the bottom. So if we're looking at slices on an MRI, they're going to proceed in that direction. And then there's the sagittal plane. And the sagittal plane proceeds from right to left. There is a particular sagittal plane that we call the mid-sagittal plane, in which the plane separates the brain into left and right hemispheres. Okay, so that's the mid-sagittal plane. So these are the three planes that I want you to understand. I could ask questions, I could show you a picture, and ask you if what you're looking at is coronal, axial, or sagittal. There are also reference directions in the central nervous system, and they do get slightly confusing because in some ways they seem like they should be the same, and in other ways they're a little bit different. Superior and inferior are also called dorsal and ventral. Superior, if you think of a four-legged animal, their back is dorsal, right? Like a shark has a dorsal fin. Um, and their back is parallel to the floor and it's superior, it's up. And ventral is related to the belly, it's down. Okay. But that is, again, considering directions when the brain is oriented as it is in a four-legged animals. We also have anterior and posterior. Anterior is also called rostral, which means towards the nose, and posterior is caudal, which means towards the tail. And here we have a brain. Well, we have a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. This is rostral. This is caudal. This is also caudal because at the point at which the brain kind of bends, our human tail, which we don't have, would be down here somewhere, right? And we do call this anterior and this posterior. In the spinal cord, we're going to consider ventral and dorsal. Okay. This diagram of the nervous system shows the divisions that we've talked about, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is divided into sensory and motor. It is also divided into autonomic and somatic, and that is in terms of the motor or effector side of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so in the brain, we have further divisions that we will talk about a little bit. There are lobes, and there are a couple lobes that aren't shown here, or at least one. The frontal lobe, which exists in front of this groove, which is called a sulcus, the central sulcus. The brain has gyri, which are these twisting structures, and it has sulci, and fissures, which are these depressions between the gyri. And it has lobes, and some of the lobes divisions are very well circumscribed and easy to see. So the division between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe is at this groove between the motor cortex and the sensory cortex, and it's called the central sulcus. So frontal lobe anterior contains the motor cortex, contains many of our speech related cell bodies, contains a lot of areas that have to do with behavior and personality. The parietal lobe, which is about sensory, receiving sensory information and processing sensory information, along with some areas relating to speech and language. Taste is a sensation here. and what are called somatosensory association areas. The occipital lobe is posterior and is a little bit less well defined in its division from the parietal lobe. Um, all of our visual tasks central nervous system visual tasks occur in the occipital lobe. And then the temporal lobe on the side, inferior to the parietal and frontal lobes. And in the temporal lobe, we process some other senses, including hearing and smell. And this again has to do with speech reception. So, not just hearing, but understanding of language. The brain, this part of the brain is called the cerebrum. There is also a area called the cerebellum, which is very important for the coordination of complex movements. Both the cerebrum and the cerebellum are composed of gray matter, and most of the gray matter is on the outside. And gray matter is cell bodies, and white matter, which are bundles of axons, myelinated axons. Myelin is white, looks white, and so we'll look at some pictures in a little while where we see the white matter of the brain. There are structures on the inside of the brain that we'll see in later pictures. There is the brain stem, which consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. Um, there are a lot of things going on in here, including the cell bodies for the cranial nerves, um, and tracts by which afferent sensory information is coming in and efferent motor information is going out. And the medulla is continuous with the spinal cord where it passes through the foramen magnum at the base of the skull. In the peripheral nervous system, we have cell bodies that are close to the spinal cord, um, that are involved in both the autonomic nervous system, where again there are cell bodies in the spinal cord that communicate with ganglia that are close to the spinal cord, sympathetic and parasympathetic, or the sympathetic ganglia are close to the spinal cord. In most cases, the parasympathetic cell bodies are further from the spinal cord, all of which are communicating with viscera, with organs and glands. And then there are motor signals that are going out to voluntary skeletal muscle. So here's this tiny little bit of embryology that I'm going to ask you to develop. The brain starts to develop very early in gestation. And at the beginning of the third week of gestation, we have a structure called the neural tube, which is already beginning to differentiate into portions. And those portions are called the prosencephalon or the forebrain, the mesencephalon or the midbrain, and the rhombencephalon or the hindbrain. Over the next couple of weeks, as these central nervous system structures continue to differentiate and develop, the forebrain divides into two parts, and we call those two parts the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The cerebrum, the cerebral hemispheres, are what grows from the telencephalon. The diencephalon becomes structures that are internal to the cerebral hemispheres and related to the thalamus. The mesencephalon or midbrain does not further divide, and then the hindbrain divides into the metencephalon and the myelencephalon, which are parts of the brain stem and the spinal cord, become parts of the brain stem and the spinal cord. So I mentioned the telencephalon, which is a a development of the forebrain that forms in to the cerebral cortex, those that layer of gray matter of neurons that is the highest level of organization and function of neurons. Um, so there are a whole bunch of different areas on the cortex that have different names, including things like the olfactory bulbs, which are gray matter nuclei, groups of cells that are involved in the sense of smell. Um, and then there are structures internal to the cortex and the bundles of white matter that are coming from the cortex. And these are cell bodies that are involved in a number of things, including movement, called the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. The diencephalon differentiates into the structures we call the thalamus, which is extremely important in sensory processing, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is a part of the brain that functions in both the central nervous system and in the endocrinological system, makes hormones. And has a ton of receptors that allow for the feedback loops that let us maintain homeostasis in any number of areas, in fluid balance, in temperature, in pressure, in all kinds of things. So the hypothalamus is a crucial part of the diencephalon. The mesencephalon becomes the midbrain, and it is part of the brain stem. It surrounds the aqueduct, which is a little tube through which central cerebrospinal fluid flows, um, and includes some other structures, a number of cranial nerve nuclei, and some structures that are extremely important in movement, the substantia nigra, which is where the dopaminergic cells that are destroyed in Parkinson's disease live, the red nucleus, which is another group of cell bodies that is involved in movement and the coordination of movement of upper extremities, um, and the cerebral peduncles, which are these bundles of axons of white matter that are leaving the cerebral hemispheres and entering the brain stem, where they will continue in tracks, both sensory and motor, into the spinal cord. Okay, and then the hindbrain becomes the metencephalon, which is the rest of the brain stem, the pons, and the cerebellum, which we talked about, that structure that's involved in the coordination of movement and of complicated movements and of balance. And then the medulla and its continuation, the spinal cord, which are the myelencephalon. Um, in the spinal cord, there is also gray matter and white matter, but in the spinal cord, the gray matter is internal to the white matter. So the tracts that carry information, afferent and efferent information, are around the outside of the spinal cord. The gray matter cell bodies that are involved in movement primarily are in the but also there are sensory neurons, are in the gray matter in the central part of the spinal cord. And then there's a central canal, which is continuous with the fourth ventricle and the ventricular system, in which cerebrospinal fluid is generated and flows inside the brain and around the brain. coming back to those lobes just to help us remember them. First, remember that the brain is within a very finite space. It's a box, right? The brain lives in this box that we call the skull. It's a rigid shaped box, and the brain fits that shape. The frontal lobe is sitting kind of behind the frontal sinuses, behind the eyeballs. Um, Here, the parietal lobe is kind of on top and the sides. The temporal lobe is inferior to the frontal and parietal lobes. The occipital lobe is here in the back. Remember that the frontal lobe is responsible for motor processing, but also for a lot of thinking and planning and personality, and all kinds of stuff happens here, and speech. The parietal lobe is receiving lot and interpreting lots of somatosensory information. Um, the temporal lobe is receiving hearing, auditory information and processing. The occipital lobe is receiving visual information and processing it. The cerebellum sits below the occipital lobe. The basal ganglia, the putamen, caudate, they are kind of inside the cerebral hemispheres. There is a structure called the corpus callosum that surrounds the ventricles, the um, structures that contain cerebrospinal fluid, and through which messages pass from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere and vice versa. So communication between hemispheres occurs at this corpus callosum. And then there are white matter tracts that are leaving the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum and entering the cerebral hemispheres and cerebellum, and traveling either up or down, afferent or efferent in the spinal cord. There is another lobe called the insula, which is kind of hiding back between, you can see it if you pull back the temporal lobe, so between the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe. And here again we can see the frontal lobes, the parietal lobes, the occipital lobes, inferiorly the temporal lobes. The interhemispheric fissure is this very deep fissure down the middle at the mid-sagittal plane. The central sulcus is an easy to see groove that very clearly separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And those, I think, you don't have to know a lot of fissures and sulci, but you need to know the interhemispheric fissure that separates the hemispheres of the cerebrum. You have to know the central sulcus, which separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and you should also know the lateral fissure, which roughly separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes. This is a picture of structures called the basal ganglia that are lateral to the thalamus. So the basal ganglia are part of the telencephalon, and the thalamus and associated structures are part of the diencephalon. The cerebral cortex, gray matter, is getting sensory information, is creating motion and sending messages to skeletal muscle. It's integrating all of that information, both the incoming and outgoing information, along with taking care of those higher functions, thinking and learning and remembering and problem solving. The basal ganglia are extremely important in coordinating slow, sustained movements and suppressing um, weird and unnecessary movements. I'm going to jump to the cerebellum, which coordinates complex repetitive movements, subconscious movements. So when you learn to play the piano, for instance, and you develop muscle memory, a lot of that is happening here in the cerebellum. It's also really important for balance and posture and maintaining tone. Our skeletal muscles are under voluntary control, but there's a lot going on with our skeletal muscles that keep us from just melting into a puddle when we are not voluntarily controlling them, and that happens in the cerebellum. Okay, the thalamus then is a relay station for sensory information and for information coming from um, efferent information coming from the cerebral cortex. So, a lot of stuff that comes in from a sensory perspective is relayed here. There are cell bodies which relay messages at the cell body at a synapse to neurons, which then are out, or the dendrite. They have axons which communicate with neurons in the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus, which is sitting under the thalamus, that's what hypothalamus means, as I said, is the part of the brain that's extremely important in homeostasis, but is also a part of the endocrine system because it is the part of the brain that controls the pituitary gland, which we consider the master gland of the endocrine system. But it controls the pituitary. It also actually makes some hormones, which could also be considered neurotransmitters. They're made in neurons in the hypothalamus that get transported to the pituitary and released by the pituitary. And then there's the brain stem, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And our cranial nerves mostly have cell bodies in the brain stem. There are also centers in the brain stem that are really important for coordinating things like your eyeball movements. When you move your eyes, they move together. And there are reflexes, the same when you move your head, your eyes move. So there are reflexes that are managed in the brainstem. There is regulation of heartbeat and breathing, of oxygen levels, or breathing, um, not oxygen levels specifically, but detectors for pH and carbon dioxide levels that are involved in regulating breathing. Um, it's important for consciousness, and if damaged, can result in a vegetative state with a loss of consciousness. And it's also, as I've said before, the structure through which tracts, bundles of axons, pass to and from the brain. So, from sensory input through the spinal cord into the brain to the thalamus, and motor um, information coming out and down the spinal cord to the lower motor neuron and the neuromuscular junction. Now, I mentioned, and this is important, and you just have to remember it. And remembering it takes probably repetition, so here I'm going to be repeating that the sensory areas and motor areas of the cerebrum, of the cerebral hemispheres, their location is crucial. The primary motor cortex is immediately anterior to the central sulcus that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So here in red is the primary motor cortex. You can see it, the gyrus of the primary motor cortex, if you look at a brain. Immediately posterior to the central sulcus is the primary sensory cortex. Again, it's a gyrus. It is immediately posterior to the central sulcus. You can see it. There are a lot of connections between the primary motor cortex and other parts of the frontal lobe that are involved in movement. So there's something called the premotor cortex and the supplemental motor area, and all of these are involved in sort of planning and coordinating and organizing a voluntary movement, but the movement itself is generated here in the primary motor cortex. Similarly, all of that somatosensory information that is coming in from the relay station called the thalamus, um, there are associations, there are ways in which it's processed, and so additional parts of the occipital lobe are the parietal association area. But I want you to remember the central sulcus, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, that the primary motor cortex is in the frontal lobe and the primary sensory cortex is in the parietal lobe. That's one of the few things that you just have to remember about neuroanatomy. You've all probably seen this before. If we look again, same color coding, that our motor cortex is in red and our sensory cortex is in blue, and our motor cortex is anterior to the central sulcus and our sensory cortex is posterior to the central sulcus. This is this, okay, but it's a single hemisphere. So you would actually have motor cortex for left and for right. The motor cortex on the right is controlling the left side of the body. The motor cortex on the left is controlling the right side of the body. But what this is illustrating is that this gyrus, which actually has a component that is down in that interhemispheric fissure, has relationships with body parts. And the amount of motor cortex that is devoted to the legs is considerably less than the amount, that is devoted to the arms and particularly to the hands, the fingers, and the thumb. Because down here you have some big muscles, gross movements, a lot of coordination. They're not unimportant, certainly very important. But up here you have multiple small muscles that require fine control for the use of the hands, the opposable thumb, all of that. So we devote a lot of cortex to the hand. We devote a ton of cortex to the face and mouth. And because we're speaking and all of the voluntary motions involved in speech, the lips and the tongue and facial expressions require a lot of motor cortex. So similarly, if we come back behind the central sulcus to the sensory cortex, we have a right and a left side. The right side is receiving information from the left half of the body. The left side is receiving information from the right half of the body. The legs, just like on motor, are kind of down in this interhemispheric fissure, as are the genitals. And then there is a lot of sensory cortex devoted to the hands and fingers and to the eyes and nose and face and lips and teeth and gums and jaw and tongue and throat, and just a little bit to the internal organs in the belly that are receiving sensory messages. So if you get appendicitis, this is where those messages are coming to. If you eat too much and your stomach feels really full, this is where those messages are coming to. Now, within that box that makes up the skull and around all of the brain are some membranes, and this is another one of those things that you just have to remember. You have to remember their relative positions. So here we have a cross section where we have scalp, that's skin, right? And it is sitting on the skull. There's something called an aponeurosis, but this is very tightly adherent. Um, and then within the skull, we have a layer of periosteum, right, which is the outer surface of bone that we call the periosteal dura mater, and that is tightly adherent to the skull. It's part of the bone, it's periosteum. There is a little space, and then there is a very leathery, tough membrane that we call the meningeal dura mater. And they're sitting right next to each other, but there is a potential space there. Immediately under the meningeal dura mater is a space that is called the subdural space. It is not labeled. That is between the meningeal dura mater and a very fine, looks a little like tissue paper, sort of translucent membrane that is called the arachnoid mater, referring to spiders, it's spider webby. And part of what makes it spider webby is that there are tons of tiny veins, vessels in the space beneath the arachnoid matter, or between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater. The pia mater is a membrane that is firmly adherent to the gray matter of the cerebral cortex. So veins are coming out of the cerebral cortex, um, passing into sinuses, which aren't shown here, um, in this subarachnoid space, which is labeled. You can have bleeding if something happens to these bridging veins into the subarachnoid space. You can have bleeding from if something happens to other vessels within the subarachnoid space, and that would be called a subarachnoid hematoma. You can have bleeding when the vessels between the dura mater and the subarachnoid space are ruptured, and that is called subdural hematoma. So the three meninges here, reverse order, are the pia mater, which is adherent to the brain, the arachnoid, or like spidery membrane with the subarachnoid space between them, and then that tough leathery coating called the meningeal dura mater. And then this periosteal dura mater is actually part of the skull. It is adherent to the bone of the skull. It's periosteum. So the central nervous system does a lot of stuff. Again, incredibly complicated, incredibly interesting. Um, Something people study for their entire lifetimes and don't learn everything about. We understand more than we used to, and still quite little in, I think, the bigger picture. But the central nervous system components include the sensory components, the processing of sensory information, the generation of motor signals, the homeostatic functions that are carried out not entirely by the hypothalamus. There are also, as I said, sensors in the brainstem. And then what we call higher functions, which are problem solving, thinking, language generation, language reception, all of those things, and memory. In this slide, we see basically a diagram um, of the brain and the spinal cord with some little bit of a flow chart. So we have sensory receptors there are sensory receptors all over the place. There are general somatosensory receptors in the skin, in tendons, in nerves and muscles. There are special senses that include um, hearing and vision and taste and smell, um, all of which end up traveling not through somatic nerves but cranial nerves. But there's signals in afferent signals. They come in to the central nervous system. They are relayed, integrated, processed in a number of areas of the brain, including the thalamus, including the sensory cortex and associated areas. Okay, so sensory information in. There is a little bit of sensation coming in from the gut, from the intra-abdominal um, organs. Okay, it's a lot less specific than the information, or less easily localized than the information coming in from the somatosensory receptors. Then that's sort of the yellow side, with a lot of integration occurring in the brain and, interestingly, in the digestive tract, where we have a whole separate little piece of our nervous system, sometimes called the enteric nervous system. Um, so it's processing, it's integrating, it's getting signals in, it's sending signals out. Okay. So efferent neurons, motor neurons, can be either somatic motor neurons that control skeletal muscles, or they can be autonomic neurons in the brain and spinal cord that could be sympathetic or parasympathetic. The autonomic neurons communicate with the enteric nervous system, and we'll talk about that in a lot more detail when we get to the gastrointestinal section of the physiology course. And the autonomic neurons, parasympathetic and sympathetic, control smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. Um, they have input into exocrine glands, right? Along with input from the neurons of the enteric nervous system. Here, this being salivary glands, but also the pancreas, which is making digestive enzymes, and the liver, which is making bile, and so forth. So there's input from the autonomic nervous system and from the enteric nervous system. There is input to some endocrine glands, not all of them, and to some adipose tissue, with responses that may feed back through sensory receptors back into the central nervous system where they're processed. And again, you get loops. So your sensory signals are processed, create motor signals, which have effects which result in more sensory information. Now, there are different modalities of the sensory system, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit, and I'm going to tell you what you need to remember. So, one of the modalities is pain, and pain has different kinds of pain, and they are transmitted through different pathways. So, for instance, the pain of being um, cut with a knife is quite different than the pain of a toothache. Um, and there's sharp pain, there's dull pain, there's deep aching pain, and there's burning pain, and they are transmitted through different pathways. Temperature has different pathways for warm and for cold, or for hot and for cold. Um, and then crude touch, which is also just touch, and tickle and itch. they are transmitted through a somatosensory pathway. All of these pathways, if you ignore the first, the prefix, the neo, paleo, and archae that we see here, they're spinothalamic. So there's spinothalamic tracts that travel in the white matter of the spinal cord from the spine to the thalamus, right? Because that's the relay station where all of this information is getting transmitted. Discriminative touch, which is the kind of touch where you can either tell um, that you are feeling 2 points on your finger, not just one, or where you can identify a quarter in the palm of your hand. That's discriminative touch. It also includes things like vibration um, and pressure, along with proprioception, which is basically position sense and the sense of movement. Um, they all travel through different pathways in the spinal cord. Um, in addition to the somatosensory pathways that travel through the spinal cord, sensation from the face and parts of the tongue travel through pathways in the trigeminal nerve, which is the fifth cranial nerve. Okay, and talking about proprioception, proprioception is the sensation of where you are in space. It includes static forces, um, again, based on muscle length, on muscle tension, and on pressure on joints. It includes movement or dynamic forces, so changes in these things. Sensory receptors may be, actually, they are in the peripheral nervous system. They may be continuous with axons. They communicate via an axon from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. So this pseudo-unipolar sensory neuron, back to way at the beginning of the other lecture, right? This is a sensory neuron. It is not in the central nervous system. It's in the dorsal root, the posterior or dorsal root ganglion. So there's a collection of cell bodies outside of the spinal cord in the nerve root in the posterior side. And this sensory afferent is detecting something here. Maybe it is detecting sharp touch. Maybe it is detecting cold from an ice cube. That signal is coming up the axon to a neuron in the central nervous system. That axon may travel a while in the spinal cord before it synapses with another neuron. These little red blobs are the Schwann cells making the myelin. So these are myelinated fibers. These are support cells around the posterior root sensory ganglion cell. So this is the peripheral process. This is the central process. This is the cell body. The peripheral process is entirely in the peripheral nervous system. The cell body is in the peripheral nervous system, but the central process is in both the peripheral and central nervous systems, and it ultimately synapses on a cell that is either in the spinal cord or in the brainstem, and it depends upon the pathways where it terminates, and the signals then cross over to the other side. This is just some another classification of the kinds of receptors in our general somatosensory system. We have pain receptors, we have temperature receptors, we have chemoreceptors, which is interesting. So, in our special senses, we have chemoreceptors for taste, particularly, but there are chemoreceptors in our general somatosensory system as well. The chemical capsaicin, which is produced by spicy hot peppers, um, creates a sensation of heat because of its interaction with chemoreceptors. And then there are mechanoreceptors that detect things like pressure and shape that are sent because the mechanical forces distort the plasma membrane. These signals may be carried through myelinated fibers or unmyelinated fibers that carry nociceptors, particularly. Um, Fast pain is carried by these myelinated type A fibers. So when you feel, when you step on a nail, you withdraw very quickly, and that's because that signal is sent very quickly. But there are slower moving pain signals as well. There are receptors in the joints and muscles that detect position. There are pressure receptors called baroreceptors in various places. And then there are our special tactile receptors that allow us to feel touch and pressure and vibration. So, you remember earlier I said that in the spinal cord there is a central canal containing spinal fluid. There are cell bodies that are gray matter, and here we have our cell bodies, and then surrounding them is white matter. So it's a little bit backwards from what's going on in the brain. The primary somatosensory neuron or cell is in the peripheral nervous system. It is outside of the central nervous system in the dorsal or posterior nerve root ganglion. These pseudo-unipolar neurons have a peripheral process and a central process. The peripheral process ends in receptors in the skin, in muscle, in joints. Okay, those signals travel in afferent signals to the in the axon of the primary somatosensory neuron, and then in the central process enter the spinal cord, which is part of the central nervous system. Now, in the central nervous system, these fibers travel for a while and then they synapse, and they might travel just a little while and synapse with a secondary somatosensory neuron in the gray matter, or they may travel quite far and synapse with a secondary somatosensory neuron in the brain stem. We have a concept we call dermatomes. Um, Dr. Fisher and Dr. Thomas will help you learn about dermatomes in anatomy. But if you imagine that each segment of the spinal cord has its own dorsal root with primary somatosensory cells that supply sensation to a segment of the body. This is a diagram showing the somatosensory supply from the cervical spine, from the thoracic spine, from the lumbar spine, and the sacral spine. Remembering that the cell bodies are in the dorsal root ganglia where the nerves emerge from the spinal column. So much of the trunk is thoracic. That makes sense. The neck and much of the arms is cervical. Okay, the lower part of the trunk and belly, pelvis, and legs are mostly lumbar, with a little bit of sacral, particularly um, on the back of the leg. Okay. Here we are showing the pathways that carry these signals. So remember that our primary neurons are in these dorsal root ganglia where the spinal nerves emerge. And they enter from the right side of the body, signals, and here we're going to talk about fine touch and position sense, proprioception. They come up the peripheral process of axon of this pseudounipolar neuron, and then the central process enters the spinal cord. It ascends a couple levels. Actually, it ascends all the way to the brainstem, where it synapses with a secondary sensory neuron, crosses to the other side, which is also called decussate, and then ascends to the thalamus where it's processed, synapses again, sending the information to the postcentral gyrus, the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, so this is the first order neuron, this is the second order neuron, and the neuron in the thalamus is the third order neuron. So that pinprick, that fine touch that you feel on your right hand out here ends up passing through two additional neurons before the signal gets to the left-sided postcentral gyrus. The pain and temperature sensation from the right side of the body, the synapse is close to the level where it enters, not always at the same level, but within a level or two. So in the gray matter of the spinal cord, in a dorsal segment, dorsal horn, I think it's called, of the spinal cord. So the information comes in. There is the peripheral process, the central process, and then a synapse with a second order neuron in the spinal cord, where those signals ascend through something called the lateral spinothalamic tract. And remember, we have all those sub tracts, the neospinothalamic, the paleospinothalamic. You can ignore those. A lot of this sensory information, pain and temperature particularly, come through the lateral spinothalamic tract, and that second order neuron passes all the way to the thalamus. So the decussation is quite low down. And what this means is that if you have a spinal cord injury, sometimes you can actually help to figure out the level of the spinal cord injury according to differences in loss of these two different kinds of sensation, fine touch and proprioception versus pain and temperature. Okay, do remember that we have these three sensory neurons. The first order neuron is in the dorsal root ganglia. The second order neuron is either in the spinal cord or in the brainstem. The third order neuron is always in the thalamus. All of these signals are relayed to a neuron in the thalamus, which sends projections to the somatosensory cortex and postcentral, just immediately posterior to the central sulcus, so the postcentral gyrus. And the crossover always occurs, but whether it occurs near the level where it enters or whether it occurs in the brainstem depends on the kind of signal and the tracts through which it is running. So the pain and temperature sensations go through the lateral spinothalamic tract on the opposite side, and fine touch and proprioception go through the fasciculi, um, gracilis and fasciculi, or fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus on the ipsilateral side. Okay, crossing over or decussating at the brainstem. So here are a whole bunch of different ascending tracts. The fasciculi, gracilis, and cuneatus are in the dorsal columns, so they're gray matter posteriorly. And the spinothalamic tracts are largely lateral. Again, uh, not gray matter, but white matter. And those white matter is organized into columns. And there are little groups of cell bodies that are uh, nuclei, and there are these organizations of sensory and motor tracts, but these are all the ascending tracts. Okay, motor pathways similarly have their own pathways. The signals are generated in the primary motor cortex, in the precentral gyrus. Um, they are sent to various places where there are cell bodies. This is an upper motor neuron in the central nervous system. Um, they end up communicating with skeletal muscle in the peripheral nervous system, where a lower motor neuron uh, generates the signal that was started by the upper motor neuron. The lower motor neuron can be in motor nuclei of the brainstem or in the motor nuclei of the spinal cord. And there are interesting things that happen. There are differences in the effects of severing a lower motor neuron and an upper motor neuron. If you sever a lower motor neuron, you get flaccid paralysis. So just paralysis and atrophy of the skeletal muscle. But if that tract, if that signal remains intact, this lower motor neuron is still working, but it is the upper motor neuron that is severed. You get paralysis, but you have this excitatory, constant tonic effect of the lower motor neuron that causes the skeletal muscle to contract. So you often get contractures, you get hyperreflexia. So there are differences in the effects on skeletal muscle depending upon whether the damage is to the upper motor neuron, perhaps a stroke killing the upper motor neuron, or perhaps a spinal cord injury severing the axon from the upper motor neuron, and something happening to the lower motor neuron itself. So here we are showing pathways involved with movement. So the signals generated in the cerebral cortex, it is processed in places like the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, depending on the kind of movement it is. It is relayed in the thalamus. The signals end up in the brain stem and traveling through pathways down the spinal cord and ending in skeletal muscle. There is some sensory information coming back from muscle to the thalamus and feeding back to the cerebral cortex. So you can tell that you've moved a muscle because of your proprioception. And just as we were looking at the ascending tracts, and you don't have to memorize these, you may later, but you don't now, is there are a large number of descending tracts, most of which in the lateral and anterior columns. So the white matter on the um, on the in the spinal cord around the outside um, is bundled into tracts that include um, a the corticospinal tracts. So instead of spinal thalamic tracts, these are corticospinal. These are fibers that are passing directly from the cortex to the spinal cord. Rubrospinal, they're coming from the red nucleus. Medullary, they're coming from the medulla. Vestibulo, they're coming these largely from the cerebellum. So there are many descending tracts, and they're named by where they start and where they end. So here's an anterior corticospinal tract.